May 1941. The North Atlantic lies beneath a shroud of fog, the kind that blurs the horizon and makes the sea itself feel watchful. On Royal Navy charts, thin blue lines trace the lifelines of Britain, convoy routes pulsing with the fuel, food, and munitions that keep an island alive. But this morning, the listening stations pick up an echo that does not belong. Something vast is moving through the mist, too large for a cruiser, too swift for a merchant ship. The operators lean closer to their dials. The signal repeats. The Atlantic has a visitor. It is not a fleet, it is a single ship. A ship designed to embody a nation's will, to defy the blockade that once starved it into surrender. Her name, Bismarck, 50,000 tons of German steel, shaped into a cathedral of armor and firepower. 8 15-inch guns, each capable of hurling a shell the weight of a small car across 20 miles of sea. Beneath her decks, turbines roar with the power of 150,000 horses, driving the Leviathan forward at 30 knots. Her hull is layered in armor up to 14 inches thick. To the men who built her, she is not merely a warship. She is vengeance forged in steel. On her bridge, Captain Ernst Lindemann peers through the fog. The crew stand silent, their boots ringing faintly against the deck plates as the engines pulse below. Around them, the cold air carries the scent of oil and salt, the smell of war returning to the Atlantic. Somewhere beyond the horizon, British convoys steam westward, unaware that a single battleship has just slipped free of the fjords and into history. Across the channel, in operations rooms filled with static and cigarette smoke, British officers study the signals. One by one, they realize what they are facing. It is not a rumor, it is the Bismarck, and she is heading for the open sea. But what they don't yet know is that this monster's first strike will shake the Royal Navy to its core and seal her own fate. At first light, the fog begins to thin. Beneath the pale sky, Bismarck cuts through the swells like a blade through silk. Her hull, rising and falling with the rhythm of the ocean, she was built to command. Beside her sails the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen, smaller, swifter, and bristling with radar and reconnaissance equipment. Together they move silently into the Denmark Strait, the grey light glinting off their armored flanks. Behind them, the fjords of Norway fade into mist. Ahead lies the open Atlantic, vast, cold, and filled with prey. In a small listening post on the Scottish coast, a young operator leans over his receiver. The static hisses, then clears. A voice cuts through, "Enemy battleship sighted." The words travel swiftly across cables and codebooks until they reach London. Inside the Admiralty war room, beneath the weight of maps and cigarette smoke, the realization sinks in. The most powerful battleship in the world is at large. Red lines sweep across the North Atlantic, tracing convoy routes, trade arteries, and danger zones. Every one of them is now within the reach of Bismarck's guns. Winston Churchill stands over the plotting table, his face lit by the faint glow of the situation map. He listens as admirals describe the risks, the distances, the odds. Then quietly, he gives the only order that matters. Sink the Bismarck. It is both command and prayer, a line drawn in the ocean between survival and humiliation. Out at sea, British merchant crews stare across empty horizons, their ships crawling westward through cold spray and uncertainty. They know that somewhere beyond the fog, a German battleship hunts unseen. The Atlantic, once their highway, has turned into a battlefield without borders. For the first time in centuries, Britain's mastery of the sea no longer feels assured. One ship, just one, has cast a shadow long enough to reach the heart of London, and even as Bismarck disappears over the curve of the earth, the hunters are already leaving port to find her. 2 years before she haunted the North Atlantic, Bismarck was born from fire and ambition. In the shipyards of Hamburg, 1939, the cranes loomed like sentinels over a forest of scaffolding. Sparks cascaded from the welders' torches, glowing briefly before dying against the cold steel hull. Day by day, a new shape began to rise from the slips, immense, symmetrical, almost sacred. To the workers below, it did not seem like the construction of a vessel, but the raising of a monument. The engineers walked her decks with a reverence usually reserved for cathedrals. Her armor belt, over a foot thick, curved with mathematical precision. Her engines, hidden deep within her hull, could drive 50,000 tons through storm and spray at 30 knots. Every rivet gleamed under the winter sun, a reflection of the nation that built her, proud, wounded, and determined never again to kneel before foreign power. Unbeatable, the shipwrights murmured. No shell could pierce her. It was a promise spoken with faith rather than reason. The Reich had poured its genius, its labor, and its myth into a single ship, a symbol of modern German destiny. When the last scaffolds came down, she towered over the harbor like a relic from a future war. Her very name carried the echo of empire. Bismarck, unifier of Germany, architect of its first rise to power. On the day of her commissioning, Admiral Günther Lutyens stood on the bridge, his cap gleaming white against the dark grey steel. To him, this ship was not merely a weapon. She was prophecy made manifest, the instrument by which Germany would reclaim mastery of the seas. Beneath the band music and speeches, the deeper message was unmistakable. This ship would avenge the humiliation of Versailles. But the sea that glittered before her remained unmoved. It had seen empires rise and vanish before, and it would see them vanish again. The Atlantic keeps no monuments, only wrecks. When Bismarck slid down the ways and kissed the water for the first time, the crowd roared as though witnessing destiny itself. Yet far beyond the harbor mouth, the ocean waited, calm, silent, and patient. Pride always sails before the storm. When the Bismarck first took to the water, she carried more than steel and gunpowder. She carried a nation's defiance. The Treaty of Versailles had once bound Germany's fleets in chains, forbidding ships of her size or ambition. Yet 2 decades later, the sound of her turbines roared across the same harbors that Allied inspectors once patrolled. The world had underestimated Germany's resolve. The Bismarck was not simply a battleship. She was proof that humiliation could be rebuilt into power. Adolf Hitler saw her as a floating declaration of revenge, vengeance given form and momentum. He toured her decks in August 1940, his eyes tracing the sweep of her guns and the gleam of her armor. To him, she was more than a naval asset. She was theater, propaganda, a message to the world that Germany had risen again. "No enemy will match her," he said. And for a time it seemed true. Her designers had crafted her with mathematical obsession. At 30 knots, she could outrun any battleship afloat. Her main belt, over 12 inches of Krupp-cemented armor, could shrug off shells that would shatter lesser ships. Her gunners could fire a ton of steel every 20 seconds. Guided by optical systems so precise, they could strike a target at 20,000 meters. Beneath her decks, the turbines purred like an engine of destiny, ready to drive her across oceans. The German press called her the Fortress of the Seas. Photographs of her prow filled the front pages, a symbol of industrial perfection and national rebirth. For the thousands who built her, she was not a machine. She was redemption, and for the men who served aboard, service was closer to faith than duty. They polished her rails with reverence, their pride stitched into the very fabric of her steel. On calm nights, when the ship moved through moonlit water, Sailors would lean against the rails and speak of her as if she were alive, a living symbol of the Reich's unbreakable will. To them, she was eternal, immune to the frailties that plagued men and nations. But history is merciless to perfection. The stronger the illusion of invincibility, the more catastrophic its unraveling. No one aboard imagined that within days of her first great voyage, this floating fortress would be hunted, crippled, and left to die in the very ocean she was meant to rule. The dream of invincibility was powerful, but the sea, as always, had other plans. On the night of May 18, 1941, the Bismarck slipped from her berth at Gotenhafen beneath a veil of fog. The docks were silent, the harbor lights dimmed to conceal her departure. Only a few officers and dockhands bore witness as the giant eased into the Baltic, her engines humming with restrained power. Operation Rheinübung, the first and only combat mission of Germany's greatest warship, had begun. Her objective was simple, brutal, and strategic: break into the Atlantic, destroy Allied convoys, and strangle Britain's supply lifelines. Admiral Gunther Lütjens stood on the bridge, flanked by the cruiser Prinz Eugen. Together they formed the most formidable surface force the Kriegsmarine could muster. Their orders were not to seek glory, but to starve an island nation into submission. Yet the operation began not with thunder, but with silence. Secrecy was their shield. The fog of the Baltic clung to the decks, muffling sound, swallowing light. By dawn, the Bismarck had vanished from Gotenhafen as though she had never existed. British reconnaissance failed to detect the departure. Intelligence analysts in London still believed the battleship lay at anchor. For 3 days, she ghosted through the North Sea unseen, a 50,000-ton shadow moving through grey water. Only the gulls and the wind knew where she was. The British listening posts strained to catch her signal, but Bismarck's radio stayed silent. To the Royal Navy, she was an absence, and absence in war breeds fear. When the first sighting came, it was almost by accident. Off the coast of Norway, a reconnaissance aircraft glimpsed her pale wake against the dark sea. Grainy photographs confirmed what London dreaded. The Bismarck was heading for the Atlantic. The news struck the Admiralty like an electric current. Within hours, fuel ships were ordered to intercept her, and convoys were rerouted far to the south. The chessboard of the North Atlantic came alive. The Royal Navy mobilized with a swiftness born of memory. Every available battleship, cruiser, and destroyer received the same command: find and sink the Bismarck. From Scapa Flow to Iceland, ships began to move, their wakes crisscrossing the grey ocean. It would be the largest naval pursuit since Trafalgar, a chase across thousands of miles of sea where one miscalculation could mean catastrophe. Yet for all their might, the British still hunted in darkness. The Atlantic stretched before them, vast, indifferent, and filled with echoes. Somewhere within that expanse, the Bismarck sailed westward, unseen and unchallenged, her guns silent, her course unwavering. But invisibility is never eternal. The ocean keeps its secrets only for a while, and soon the hunter would be hunted. At dawn, on May 24, 1941, the North Atlantic seethed with wind and mist. The sea around the Denmark Strait was a battlefield waiting to be born, a narrow grey corridor where ice met fog and echoes danced across primitive radar screens. Within that frozen theatre, the Bismarck and Prinz Eugen advanced southward, unaware that 2 shadows were closing in from the west. The British battlecruiser HMS Hood, pride of the Royal Navy, and the newly commissioned Prince of Wales had found their prey. On Hood's bridge, Admiral Lancelot Holland studied the flickering horizon. He knew what he faced, the most powerful warship afloat, But he also carried the weight of British tradition. The hood was more than steel. She was national memory, a relic of empire, the embodiment of naval supremacy. At 5:52 a.m., the order was given. The British opened fire first, their shells tracing long arcs through the fog toward the enemy they could barely see. The German lookouts spotted the flashes almost simultaneously. On Bismarck's bridge, Captain Ernst Lindemann remained calm, his voice even. "Open fire!" The response was mechanical, practiced, precise. 4 turrets turned as one, the barrels rising to meet the horizon. Rangefinders whirred. Calculations rippled through the fire control teams below deck. Seconds later, the ship shuddered as her first broadside thundered out. 8 shells, each weighing nearly a ton, screaming toward Hood. At first, the shots fell short. Then, with cold correction, the next salvo found its mark. At 5:57, a single 15-inch shell plunged through Hood's thin deck armor and reached her aft magazine. What followed was instantaneous. A white flash, then a column of flame that split the morning mist. The sound tore through the wind like the sky itself had cracked open. In less than 8 minutes, the ship that had symbolized British might broke apart and vanished beneath the sea. Of her crew of 1,418, only 3 men survived. For a moment, the Bismarck's bridge was silent. Even among the victors, the scale of destruction stunned. A single hit had erased a legend. Then came the realization they had done what no navy had done in 2 centuries, destroyed the pride of the Royal Navy in open combat. The shock rippled through the fleet, through London, through the nation. But victory came at a price. A British shell had struck Bismarck's forward fuel tanks, bleeding oil into the sea, a dark trail marking her path. She had won the duel, but the wound would betray her. As the Bismarck turned south toward France, the ocean closed over the Hood's grave. The Germans believed they had achieved immortality. The British vowed vengeance. The hunt was no longer strategic, it was personal. When news of the Hood's destruction reached London, it struck the nation with the force of an earthquake. For 20 years, she had been the embodiment of British sea power, the visible proof that Britannia still ruled the waves. Her loss was unthinkable, almost blasphemous, but the message was undeniable. In the Admiralty's communication rooms, teleprinters rattled out a single line that captured the fury of a nation. "Sink the Bismarck." Within hours, every available warship across the Atlantic theater received the order. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and carriers, anything that could move, armed or half-armed, was drawn into the chase. The home fleet steamed from Scapa Flow. The Force H group left Gibraltar. Even ships guarding convoys were pulled away. The Royal Navy began to move like a tightening fist, determined to avenge the loss that had broken its pride. In Parliament, Winston Churchill spoke with uncharacteristic restraint, but his words carried the same command that had already circled the globe. This ship must be destroyed. Across Britain, people gathered in pubs, factories, and railway stations to read the morning papers. The headlines said little, but they didn't need to. Hood sunk, only 3 survivors. Beneath those words, a nation's anger condensed into purpose. The war at sea had become personal. Far to the north, in the cold expanse of the Atlantic, the Bismarck moved southward through heavy weather. Her crew felt both triumph and dread. They had slain the greatest warship of their enemy, but victory had left them bleeding. British shells had pierced a fuel tank below her waterline. Thick oil now leaked in a widening trail behind her, a black fingerprint across the grey sea. Captain Lindemann ordered pumps to run without pause. Engineers labored in the roar of machinery, sealing bulkheads, rigging temporary patches, and praying the pumps would hold. The ship that had been designed as a fortress now fought for her survival. Every vibration of her turbines carried the reminder that she was wounded. Salt water mixed with oil, and the smell filled the lower decks. Men worked in knee-deep water under dim emergency lights, their faces streaked with grease. Above them, the gunnery crews stood ready, scanning the mist for enemies they could not see but knew were coming. The Atlantic, vast and indifferent, had become a trap. Radar pings echoed from unseen horizons. The Prince Eugen, still undamaged, was ordered to break away and operate independently. Alone now, the Bismarck turned toward the French coast, hoping to reach the safety of occupied ports. The crew's conversations grew quieter. Every man aboard understood what it meant to be hunted in open water. Overhead, the Royal Air Force began searching for her, while British codebreakers in London strained to intercept her transmissions. They caught fragments, bearings, requests for refueling, small clues in the static that began to reveal her course. In the Admiralty plotting rooms, naval officers marked each report with pins on a massive chart. The lines began to converge. The noose was tightening. For the men aboard Bismarck, the hours blurred together. Constant labor, constant vigilance. The engines throbbed. The ship's doctor treated burns and exhaustion. Chaplains moved silently among the wounded, whispering prayers beneath the thunder of machinery. Even as the pumps strained to keep her afloat, she pressed on, a wounded colossus refusing to die. And across the sea, her hunters drew closer. From Iceland to Gibraltar, British warships plowed through the swells, guided by fragmentary intelligence and a single unifying purpose. To them, the mission was no longer tactical, it was moral. The Bismarck had become more than an enemy warship. She was a symbol of defiance that had to be erased, a ghost that haunted the Empire's honor. And though her crew did not yet know it, the ocean that had sheltered her in silence was about to betray her with sound. In the skies above the Atlantic, engines began to warm. The hunters had found her trail. By the evening of May 26th, the Atlantic had become a chessboard of radio signals, oil stains, and shadows. In London, the Admiralty's operations room glowed dimly under the green haze of plotting lamps. Officers leaned over maps crowded with pins and grease pencil lines, tracing the last known movements of the Bismarck. Somewhere out in that vast grey wilderness, the wounded giant was still running, southward, toward France, and if she reached the safety of air cover from the Luftwaffe, she would live to fight again. But the sea was whispering her secrets. Spotter planes from Catalina patrols swept low over the waves, catching glimpses of the black trail spreading behind her. That oil slick, the wound that could not heal, betrayed her more faithfully than any spy. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park, working through the static and storm, began to piece together intercepted fragments. Fuel shortage, damaged, proceeding to Saint-Nazaire. Each phrase, faint and broken, tightened the noose around the German battleship. On board Bismarck, the mood had turned grim. The engines still thundered, but their power could not hide the truth. The sea state worsened, the pumps groaned, the men worked without pause, sealing bulkheads, patching leaks, and praying that the oil would hold until they reached the coast. Every vibration in the steel hull carried an undertone of anxiety. The crew had seen what the British were capable of. Now they waited for the inevitable reply. At dusk, 400 miles to the southwest, the aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal turned into the wind. Her deck crews worked under driving rain, lashing down torpedoes, priming engines, and checking the fragile fabric wings of Fairey Swordfish biplanes. These aircraft were relics of another era, slow, open cockpit machines, more at home in 1918 than 1941. Yet tonight, they were all the Royal Navy had. Their task: find Bismarck in the storm and cripple her before she could reach safety. The pilots climbed into their cockpits, leather gloves stiff with cold, goggles streaked with salt. One by one, the engines sputtered to life. Propellers blurred, wings trembled, and the deck filled with the whine of wind and rain. At 9:00 p.m., the first wave lifted off into darkness, 15 fragile silhouettes vanishing into the gale. The ocean swallowed them whole. They found her by lightning and luck. In the flashes of stormlight, Bismarck loomed below them, a mountain of steel cutting through the Black Sea. The anti-aircraft guns opened fire instantly, lacing the night with tracers. The swordfish dove through it, gliding low above the waves, their wings soaked and shaking. One torpedo missed. Another struck the armor belt and ricocheted harmlessly away. But one, just one, found the mark no designer could protect. It hit near the stern, beneath the waterline. The explosion itself was modest, muffled by the sea. Yet it jammed Bismarck's rudder hard to port. Almost immediately, her great hull began to list, turning helplessly in a widening circle. The ship's engines still thundered, but now they fought against themselves. Strength turned against purpose. The bridge officers tried reversing turbines, altering speed, anything to regain control. Nothing worked. The Bismarck was trapped in her own wake, spinning slowly beneath the storm. In the carrier's operations room, a young radio operator heard the words that ended the chase. "Target hit, rudder disabled." Around him, men exhaled in disbelief. The invincible battleship, the fortress of the seas, had been undone not by shells or strategy, but by a single torpedo dropped from a biplane made of canvas and wire. At that moment, 50,000 tons of German engineering became a drifting hulk. The hunter had become the hunted, and in the grey dawn that followed, the British fleet moved in for the kill. Darkness settled over the Atlantic like a shroud. Rain drifted in long, slanting veils across the crippled Bismarck, each droplet illuminated for an instant by the ship's searchlights before vanishing into the sea. Inside the hull, the wounded giant groaned with the rhythm of her engines, still turning, still fighting the rudder that refused to obey. Deep below decks, engineers worked knee-deep in oily water, their tools slipping in the cold, their hands raw from salt and strain. They had been at it for hours, hacking at steel and hydraulics, desperate to free the jammed rudder that had doomed them. But the damage ran deeper than machinery. It was as if the ocean itself had taken control. Admiral Günther Lutyens knew it. On the bridge, his face was lit by the dull glow of navigation lamps. He stood silent for a long time, watching the dark horizon, then turned to his radio operator and dictated his final message to Berlin. "Ship will fight to the last shell. Long live the Führer." The transmission crackled into the ether, a message less of loyalty than of resignation. Everyone aboard understood what it meant. There would be no rescue, no escape. The Bismarck would face her fate alone. Around them, the Atlantic had grown eerily quiet. The storm that had once hidden them had passed, leaving only a heavy mist and the low hiss of rain. In that calm, the British fleet gathered. On the edge of the horizon, faint points of light appeared. The glow of funnels, the flicker of signal lamps, the slow, silent movement of steel giants closing in. They did not attack. Not yet. They waited for daylight, for visibility, for the final blow to be seen by all. On Bismarck's decks, men stood in small groups, smoking what might be their last cigarettes, staring toward those distant lights. Some spoke of home, of Hamburg, of Bremen, of the smell of the shipyards where she had been born. Others said nothing. They could feel the ocean rising beneath them, as if the sea itself were holding its breath. In the wardroom, a ship's chaplain gathered the crew who could still come. The electric lights flickered as he began to pray, not only for the men of Bismarck, but for those who waited beyond the horizon, preparing to end her. Even the most hardened among them lowered their heads. War had stripped away illusion. Victory and defeat now looked the same beneath the rain. Above, Admiral Lutyens paced the bridge. Captain Lindemann stood beside him, calm and resolute, his cap pulled low against the drizzle. Neither man spoke of surrender. The Bismarck had been built to be invincible, and if she could not live up to that ideal, she would at least die by it. Around them, the officers wrote their final entries, secured the ship's colors, and readied the guns. Each turret was loaded and locked, the last gesture of defiance from a ship already doomed. Hours passed. Midnight faded into the slow gray of pre-dawn. Somewhere beyond the fog, the British ships adjusted their bearings, ready to open fire at first light. The sea lay unnaturally still, its waves muted by wind and oil. Every man on both sides felt the same uneasy weight, the knowledge that what would happen next was not triumph, but conclusion. As the first faint line of light crept over the eastern horizon, the rain began to ease. The Bismarck turned gently with the swell, her rudder still frozen, her guns aimed at a horizon already bristling with enemies. The night had given them time to pray, to repair, to hope. But dawn would bring no mercy. The sea was waiting to bear witness. May 27th, 1941. The sky over the Atlantic is a pale, indifferent gray. The rain has passed, leaving the sea unnaturally calm, a stage waiting for the final act. At 8:47 a.m., from the east, two dark shapes emerge from the haze, HMS King George III and HMS Rodney. The British battleships advanced deliberately, their guns already trained. For the men aboard Bismarck, there is no surprise left, only certainty. The end has come. Admiral Lutyens gives no speech. Captain Lindemann issues the only order that matters: prepare for battle. Across the crippled ship, sailors take their stations. Some are barefoot, their uniforms stiff with salt. The forward turrets are loaded by hand. The rangefinders, damaged and blinded by the previous day's attack, are useless. The Bismarck, once an instrument of precision, now fights half-blind, her steering jammed, her hull heavy with water. At exactly 8:47, the British open fire. A dozen guns speak as one. The sound is a physical force, a concussion that rolls across the sea and hammers against the German decks. Shells the size of small cars arc overhead, their trails fading into white smoke. Seconds later, the first salvo lands short. Then the second walks closer. The third finds its mark. Steel screams. Bismarck's forward superstructure erupts in flame. A 16-inch shell from Rodney smashes into her bridge, tearing through decks, killing gunners, radio men, and signalers in a single instant. The blast echoes through the ship like a heartbeat that will not stop. In the plotting room, charts ignite. Men stumble through smoke, shouting orders that can no longer be heard over the thunder of British guns. Still, Bismarck fires back. Her surviving turrets elevate, their muzzles flashing through the haze. For a few moments, she seems alive again, hurling steel in defiance at her encircling enemies. But her aim is broken. Her shells fall wide, blind and futile. One shell passes close over Rodney's bridge, the last near miss of a dying ship. Then her main director is obliterated, and the German fire grows erratic, then scattered, then silent. The British ships close in. Shells rain down without pause, each impact stripping away another layer of armor, another piece of pride. Rodney's guns pound the hull at point-blank range. Secondary batteries join in, hammering the upper decks until no shape remains unbroken. Smoke boils up from the shattered midsection, rising like a storm cloud that blots out the morning light. Inside, the ship has become an inferno. Bulkheads glow red-hot. Ammunition lockers explode in sequence. Fire hoses lie burned through, useless. In the engine room, men still work, not to win, but to give power to the guns, to keep fighting until nothing is left to fight with. The sea outside is white with shell splashes, the air thick with soot and iron. On the upper deck, a young officer watches his comrades fall. Around him, what was once a battleship now resembles a graveyard of twisted metal. He turns to a comrade and speaks quietly, almost to himself. "We are paying for our pride." By 9:30, the great ship is no longer a combat vessel. Her guns are silent, her command structure gone. The British fire slackens, not from mercy, but from completion. The Bismarck drifts amid her own smoke, still afloat, still defiant, but mortally wounded. Her flag somehow still flying amid the ruin. In 90 minutes, Germany's mightiest warship has been reduced to wreckage. Yet even in destruction, she refuses to sink. The ocean, as if reluctant to claim her, holds her aloft for a few final moments, a monument to the arrogance and brilliance that built her. But the British are not finished. Torpedoes are readied. The sea, patient until now, prepares to close its jaws. The Bismarck burned beneath a grey Atlantic sky. Her turrets lay twisted, her deck plates peeled back like paper. The sea around her boiled with fire and debris. Smoke rose in black columns, merging with the low clouds until ship and storm became one. The battle had lasted less than 2 hours, yet the destruction spoke of centuries. The end of an age when armor and pride alone could rule the sea. On the shattered bridge, Admiral Lutyens was gone, killed when a shell tore through the superstructure minutes before. Command now passed to Captain Ernst Lindemann, a man still standing, though surrounded by ruin. His uniform was scorched, his hands blackened with soot, but his voice remained steady. Below him, what was left of the Bismarck's crew fought a battle that no longer had meaning, one against fire, flooding, and despair. The ship listed 20 degrees to port. Compartments below the waterline filled faster than the pumps could empty them. Fires burned uncontrollably from bow to stern, licking through ventilation shafts and tearing across the deck. Ammunition lockers were empty. The once mighty guns hung silent and lifeless. For a time, the Germans kept returning fire with their remaining weapons, not out of hope, but duty, the instinct of sailors who had sworn an oath never to surrender. But even duty has a limit. When the last shell was gone and the flames reached the forward magazines, Lindemann gave the order no captain wishes to give. "Abandon ship," his voice carried across the intercom, calm, measured, final. For a moment, no one moved. The men stared at one another, exhausted, deafened, and blackened by smoke. To leave their ship felt like betrayal. She had been their world, their home, and their pride. Yet survival demanded what honor resisted. Lifeboats were lowered where possible. Rafts were thrown into the burning sea. The order spread through every deck. All hands topside. Below, the engine rooms were already flooding. Men climbed ladders through rising water and burning air, their faces lit by the flicker of flames and emergency lamps. On the upper deck, the wind howled through twisted steel, scattering embers into the surf. Even as the end drew near, no one struck the colors. The German ensign still flew at the stern, tattered, half-burned, but visible. Sailors refused to lower it, not out of defiance, but reverence. If the Bismarck was to die, she would die beneath her flag. Around them, the British ships had ceased major fire, their crews watching in silence as the crippled Titan began to die on Herbonen. Yet stray shells continued to fall, habit and haze delaying mercy. At 10:20 a.m., a final torpedo from HMS Dorsetshire struck her amidships. The blow was not cruel, it was an act of ending. Water rushed in through her torn hull. The ship heaved violently, her stern lifting, her bow plunging beneath the surface. Men on deck scrambled for the rails, diving into the oil-slicked water as the great hull began to roll. The sound of twisting steel carried over the waves, deep, resonant, almost alive. At 10:40, the Bismarck capsized and slipped beneath the sea, her propellers spinning skyward one last time before vanishing into the deep. The water closed over her with a hiss, and then there was silence. In less than 5 minutes, she was gone. Out of more than 2,200 men, only 115 were pulled from the freezing water by British destroyers. Most of the rest perished from wounds, exhaustion, or the cold. For the survivors, there was no triumph, only disbelief, the sense that they had witnessed the death not only of their ship, but of something larger, the illusion that perfection could defy nature or fate. The Atlantic rolled over her grave as though nothing had happened. The waves reclaimed their stillness, and in the quiet that followed, even the victors felt no joy, only the weight of what they had done. Far below, the Bismarck came to rest on the ocean floor, her flag still faintly visible in the darkness. The sea had taken her, but not her story. The sea that morning was black with oil. Waves rolled through wreckage, splintered timbers, lifebelts, and bodies drifting among torn fragments of steel. A thin rain began to fall, softening the fire that still burned on the surface, washing the salt from faces that could no longer feel it. In the aftermath of the storm, the Atlantic lay quiet, as though exhausted by its own violence. The battle was over. Among the debris, small clusters of men clung to rafts and wreckage. Their uniforms were soaked in oil, their eyes hollow, stunned, uncomprehending. Some called out faintly for help, others for shipmates who could no longer answer. The sea that had carried them in pride now held them in silence. For those who survived, time lost its shape, minutes stretching into hours beneath the grey rain. From the east, the shapes of British destroyers approached slowly through the haze. Their crews lined the rails, looking out across the devastation. They had come not as victors, but as witnesses. Orders crackled over loudspeakers. Prepare to pick up survivors. Small boats were lowered, engines humming against the stillness. The men who had hunted the Bismarck now leaned over their decks to pull her sailors from the water. There were no cheers, no cries of triumph, only the sound of ropes tightening, the thud of bodies lifted aboard, the murmurs of exhaustion. Oil-streaked faces looked up at their rescuers, enemies by uniform, equals by suffering. One British sailor offered a cigarette to a shivering German, lighting it with a trembling match. They said nothing. There was nothing left to say. A Royal Navy officer stood at the rail, watching as the last survivors were brought in. He turned to a colleague, his voice quiet, almost reverent. She fought well. It was not praise, nor pity, only acknowledgement. For all its horror, the battle had revealed something that transcended sides, the shared courage of men who fought and died inside a machine too proud to live. Around them, the sea continued its slow work of erasure. The waves lapped at the spreading oil, folding it beneath the surface. The fires dimmed and went out. Within minutes, the Atlantic began to reclaim its stillness. The Bismarck was gone, not in explosion or spectacle, but in the long, slow silence that follows when history exhales. Below the waves, 2 miles down, she came to rest on the seabed. Upright as if still sailing, her hull scarred but intact. The guns that once thundered over the North Atlantic now pointed into eternal darkness. Around her, the water was calm, colder, quieter, untouched by time. The ocean had become her tomb, her armor unbroken, her secret sealed away beneath the pressure of the deep. When explorers found her decades later, they would describe her not as wreckage, but as monument, a cathedral of steel preserved in silence. The flag was gone, but the shape remained, noble and tragic, the final expression of a vanished idea, that a single ship, no matter how perfect, could command an ocean. In her death, the Bismarck marked the end of an era. The age of the battleship, of gunfire and armor and national pride forged in steel, had passed. The seas would soon belong to aircraft carriers, submarines, and unseen weapons. Technology had outpaced tradition. Power no longer floated, it flew. For those who stood on deck that day, watching the last ripples fade across the water, victory felt indistinguishable from loss. The great symbol of German might had been destroyed, yet something larger had gone down with her, the belief that war could still be fought with honor, or that courage alone could defy the march of progress. The engines of the destroyers turned for home. The rain began again, and in the vastness of the Atlantic, the sound of waves returned, steady, timeless, indifferent. The Bismarck was gone, but the silence she left behind would echo for generations. When the news reached Berlin, it did not come with fanfare or ceremony. There was no announcement, no headlines, no victory speeches from the Reich Ministry of Propaganda. Only silence, the kind that fills corridors when the truth is too heavy to bear. In the bunker offices beneath the Reich Chancellery, Joseph Goebbels read the message twice, his fingers tightening around the paper until it creased. The Bismarck was gone. Germany's greatest warship, the embodiment of its naval rebirth, had lasted barely 9 days at sea. Goebbels ordered the news buried, censored from the morning bulletins. "No radio mention," he said. "Not yet." But silence could not hold forever. The men of the Kriegsmarine already knew. Families in Hamburg, Kiel, and Wilhelmshaven waited for letters that would never arrive. And within hours, the whispers began, of a ship surrounded, of orders to fight to the last shell, of the sea swallowing the pride of the Reich. In the Wolf's Lair, Hitler received the report privately. He listened without reaction, staring at the map that showed the North Atlantic as a blank grey space. For months he had spoken of the Bismarck as more than a ship, as a symbol of destiny itself, proof that Germany's will could defy history. Now that symbol was gone, reduced to coordinates on a chart. "The Navy has failed me," he muttered. "It always fails me." But what he did not understand was that it was not the Navy that had failed. It was the illusion that power, no matter how formidable, could escape the limits of chance. The loss rippled through Germany like a quiet wound. In shipyards and classrooms, the story spread in fragments, rumor first, then disbelief, then mourning. The Bismarck had been their monument to modernity, the floating proof of their resurgence from the humiliation of 1918. If she could be destroyed, what could not? For the first time, the myth of German invincibility cracked. Beneath the speeches and slogans, doubt took root. The propaganda ministry tried to shape the narrative, to turn defeat into martyrdom. Goebbels' papers spoke of heroism, of sacrifice, of the unsinkable German spirit. But the public could sense the hollowness. The truth was simpler and harder. Even the perfect machine could die. The sea had reduced ideology to physics, tonnage, armor, velocity, and stripped it of meaning. In naval circles, the reaction was quiet but profound. Officers who had once spoken of the battleship as the ultimate weapon now questioned its purpose. They studied the British reports, the aerial reconnaissance, the torpedo that crippled Bismarck's rudder, a single hit from a slow, fabric-winged biplane. The lesson was unmistakable. No fortress of steel could survive in a world where war had moved to the skies. The Bismarck had not only been defeated, she had been outlived by her own obsolescence. Across the Channel, the British Admiralty understood this with mixed emotion. There was relief, even gratitude, but little celebration. The Bismarck's destruction restored their faith, their balance, their sense of command over the Atlantic. Yet the victory was also a mirror. They had witnessed the fall of a ship that looked like one of their own. The age of the great battleship, theirs and Germany's alike, was ending. In Berlin, the official report was filed, stamped, and locked away. No speeches followed. The name Bismarck was not spoken in Hitler's presence again. But in the minds of those who had believed in her, something fundamental had shifted. The war would continue, but the confidence that once burned so brightly had dimmed. Because when a nation builds its pride on perfection, even one loss becomes a prophecy. And in the smoldering silence that followed, Germany's leaders failed to see what history already had. Power built on pride always sinks faster than steel. For nearly half a century, the Bismarck existed only as memory, a story told in veterans' recollections and weathered black and white photographs. The coordinates of her resting place were known only to the sea, somewhere in the grey immensity of the North Atlantic, 2 miles beneath the waves. For decades, explorers searched in vain, scanning endless stretches of ocean floor. The Atlantic, as always, guarded its dead with silence. Then, in 1989, technology caught up with memory. Dr. Robert Ballard, the oceanographer who had found the Titanic just 4 years earlier, turned his instruments toward the coordinates of the last transmission from the British destroyers. His team aboard Nor deployed submersible cameras and sonar arrays into the black depths, tracing the ocean floor like archaeologists of a lost civilization. Days passed with nothing but static and silt. Then, on June 8th, the image appeared. A shadow first, then the unmistakable geometry of a hull. 15,700 feet below the surface, the Bismarck stood upright on the seabed, perfectly balanced as if still commanding an invisible fleet. Time had not broken her. The Atlantic had preserved her. Her guns, silent for half a century, still pointed toward an enemy that no longer existed. Her bridge remained intact, her turrets in place, her lines graceful even in ruin. When the cameras descended closer, the details emerged in the ghostly light. The impact of shells scarred her sides. Her stern twisted from the torpedo that ended her flight. Yet the rest, the decks, the armor, the symmetry of her construction, seemed untouched, frozen in a kind of mechanical dignity. She was no longer a weapon, nor a symbol of conquest. She was a monument to ambition, to tragedy, to the human desire to build something too perfect to last. On the monitor screens aboard Nor, the crew fell silent. No one spoke of victory or defeat. The mood was not triumph but reverence. Engineers leaned forward to study the rivets, the plating, the stillness of her silhouette. Historians whispered quietly, their voices subdued, as though inside a cathedral. Cameras drifted past her nameplate, Bismarck, still faintly visible under layers of marine snow. The letters, once meant to inspire fear, now stirred something closer to sorrow. The Atlantic had not consumed her, it had entombed her. Cold, pressure, and darkness had kept her sealed from decay. Around her hull, small creatures glowed like embers in the abyss, life reclaiming what war had left behind. No divers would touch her. She was declared a war grave, her 2,000 crewmen still aboard. Even in death, she commanded respect. Ballard later described her not as a wreck, but as a relic. "She lies like a great church," he said, silent and proud. The words captured something beyond the technical, the transformation of a warship into a moral artifact. The Bismarck was no longer a story of nations or ideologies. She had become a meditation on the limits of human pride. For engineers, her discovery offered lessons in design, a study of strength and failure, of armor that held and systems that did not. For historians, it offered closure. For those who had served at sea, it was something deeper, a reminder that beneath every symbol of power lies fragility, and beneath every victory, loss. The cameras moved across her decks one final time before withdrawing. The lights faded, leaving her once more in the eternal dark, a leviathan asleep beneath the pressure of the deep, untouched by time, unbothered by memory. Even in ruin, she commanded silence, and in that silence, she taught what she could not in life, that machines may fade, empires may crumble, but the lessons they leave behind, of arrogance, of courage, of consequence, endure far longer than steel. Above her, the Atlantic closed again, indifferent as ever. The ship that had once challenged an empire now rested in peace, her story complete, her warning eternal. The Bismarck was built to terrify the world, and for a brief moment she did. Her very name carried weight, an echo of empire, a declaration of strength made manifest in steel. When she first set sail in May of 1941, she seemed to embody everything her nation desired: precision, power, invincibility. She was the dream of control forged into metal, a promise that destiny could be engineered. Yet destiny is the one element man has never learned to master. The Bismarck's defeat did not come from inferiority nor from cowardice. It came from the quiet irony that history reserves for the proudest creations. She was perfect, too perfect, designed for a world that no longer existed. While her armor could withstand anything imagined by her builders, it could not withstand what they refused to imagine: chance, adaptation, and the future itself. Her end was not merely a naval disaster, it was a parable. For all her power, she was destroyed not by a fleet greater than hers, but by a single torpedo dropped from an obsolete biplane, a relic of an earlier war. That moment was more than tactical misfortune. It was symbolic. It marked the instant when brute strength gave way to innovation, when speed and courage yielded to the quiet supremacy of technology. The Bismarck fell not to failure, but to evolution. Perfection blinded her creators to vulnerability. In the boardrooms of Berlin and the shipyards of Hamburg, engineers had spoken of armor, of displacement, of gunnery. They had not spoken of humility. The ship that symbolized domination became, in the end, a warning against hubris, the belief that any creation, however vast, could outlast the truths of nature and time. The sea proved otherwise. It always does. Today she rests 2 miles beneath the surface, her hull upright, her lines still proud. The ocean has claimed her without malice, without ceremony. It holds her not as a conqueror or a corpse, but as a monument. In her silence lies the truth she could not speak in life, that no empire, no machine, no man can command the sea forever. Those who study her now do so not in worship, but in reflection. Her name has outlived the cause she served. Her story has outlasted those who built her. What remains is not glory, but understanding. History's judgment is not vengeance, it is remembrance. In her rise and fall lies the entire arc of human ambition: to reach beyond limits, to build something indestructible, and to discover, again and again, that nothing we make escapes the laws that bind us all. The ocean keeps her secret, the waves move on, but deep below, encased in darkness and pressure, she endures. A silent cathedral to mankind's illusion of control. They built her to rule the seas, but the sea ruled her fate.